Giovanni Garbeili. Giovanni Garbeili lived from 1555 through 1612. Although most of his life was spent during the 16th century, he is associated with the 17th century and with the musical Baroque. A quick look at his name confirms that he is from the Italian-speaking world. In fact, the name Giovanni is not at all exotic to you. You heard it in our last unit in the name of Giovanni Pierluigi da Palestrina, and you therefore know that it is an Italian name. Although you already know that there was no country called Italy before the mid-1800s, we can actually be quite specific about where Giovanni Garbeili came from in terms of a country. He was a Venetian. Now, Venetian is simply the adjectival form of the word Venice. Venice today is just a city in what is now northern Italy. But during the Renaissance and the Baroque era, in fact right up until it fell to Napoleon in 1797, Venice was a republic. It was an independent country. It was one of the wealthiest and most important countries in all of Europe. Garbeili spent his entire career as an organist at the Church of San Marco in Venice. Now I'm going to take a few minutes to tell you a good bit of information about this remarkable church. In fact, I'm going to ask you to take a look at two pictures of it. You can see two of them, an exterior view and an interior view below your podcast screen, and I will be telling you about them. Now please be aware that this is not a course in architecture appreciation, but I need to tell you about this building, how it is configured, so that you can understand its musical practices and you can understand the work that we're going to hear by Giovanni Garbeili. So let's begin to take a look at this church whose architecture inspired its musical practices. And in fact, its musical practices were then imitated throughout Europe. So this building, its architecture, and its resulting musical practices are very important for the history of music. If you take a look at the exterior of the building, you would hardly recognize this as a church. Indeed, it's a very odd-looking building indeed, and one of the reasons that it looks so odd is that it was copied from an Oriental design. It is modeled after a church that once stood in Constantinople, and you can tell that it is an Oriental design because it has many domes on it. Certainly the West cultivated domed buildings, but in the West, domed buildings usually have one dome, like our state capitol, like our national capitol building, etc. Oriental buildings that have domes, however, sometimes have more than one dome. Think of the Taj Mahal, for example, that has several domes on it. Now let's take a look at the interior of the building. Because it was so heavily constructed and it required massive pillars to hold up its stone roof and the stone domes atop the building, there are many high lofts all around the church. If you take a look at this 18th century painting of the interior, you can even see people standing in these balconies high above the floor, observing the proceedings on the floor below. These balconies, of course, were not used just for sightseeing, but they were used for musical purposes. They were used for choirs, organs, instrumental bands, etc., especially those two balconies on either side of the altar. Because of this situation with all of these balconies, ever since the Middle Ages the church always had two organs, and it also always employed two organists during the time that it had organs in the church itself. Not only were organs accommodated in the balconies, but musical ensembles were placed there as well, and beginning in the Renaissance there were always two choirs and two instrumental bands. in regular use for Sunday services throughout the year. Now this extravagant array of performing forces, 2 organs, 2 choirs, 2 instrumental bands, placed high above the floor at some distance from each other, did not go unnoticed by the composers who wrote music for those ensembles. And in fact, this circumstance inspired a musical texture that we call antiphony, or antiphonal in the adjectival form. You have already seen the word antiphon, so you know what the stems of this word mean. The PHON means sound, anti means against. It literally means one sound against another. And it is used to refer to music that is passed from one group to another. And by this I do not mean simply the singing of one section of a song by one group and then another group taking up the remainder of the song or the next section, but I'm referring specifically to a musical texture that produces an echo effect. It very often seems that one group is echoing what the other one is producing, and the music overlaps. It doesn't simply stop, a period of silence, and then the next group begins, but the 2 groups actually overlap. Now you certainly must be given to contemplation about this extravagant array of performing forces. Heavens, most churches these days are lucky if they have 1 organ and 1 organist, let alone 2 of them, 1 choir, or 1 instrumental band, not to mention 2 of them. And the reason for this extravagance is quite simple. San Marco was not a typical parish church. It did not depend on donations from its parishioners. Instead, San Marco was a state church. It was funded by the Venetian government, and it was an important landmark and symbol for the city. It was both the spiritual and the cultural center of Venice. It was certainly the spiritual center because it contained the bones of one of the 12 apostles, St. Mark, and it was also the cultural center because it was a symbol of Venice's importance and its wealth. The leaders of Venice, therefore, spared no expense to make sure that this magnificent building had the finest music performing forces available anywhere. All the musicians of San Marco, its music director, its organist, its choir singers, its instrumental players, were hired and paid by the Venetian government, and they made sure that they got the very best performers that they possibly could.